Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get across stacks of sources fast.
Helping you get informed.
Exactly. And today we're tackling, well, a really perplexing diplomatic puzzle. It's about the U.S. government. You usually think of them as this pragmatic global operator, right?
And a strategic player on the world stage.
Yeah. But when it comes to its relationship with Israel, there's this persistent pattern where the approach just seems kind of peculiar sometimes.
It really is fascinating. It's like Dr. Algernon Fickel puts it, one of the scholars whose work we looked at, it's like watching a chess master suddenly make moves that seem, well, totally counterintuitive to their own game plan.
Which brings us straight to what we want to explore in this deep dive. Why does the U.S. government often seem to be looking at its relationship with Israel through lenses of, say, naivete or maybe delusion, or even acting as an enabler, or perhaps being in denial?
And we've got a pretty compelling stack of sources to help us unpack this. There are scholarly papers from, as you mentioned, Dr. Fickel, also Dr. Hypothetical Wit, and a really detailed one called US Govt Israel Paper.pdf.
Right.
And together they offer this rigorous, sometimes quite pointed, look at what some are calling a grand paradox.
So the plan is to examine this whole complex thing through four specific lenses. We'll look at perceived naivete, then delusion, enablement, and finally, denial.
Yep.
Our goal is to pull out the key nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, give you the context you need to understand this really multifaceted issue, hopefully with some useful insights.
Okay, let's dive in. The first lens, naivete.
Naivete.
So this basically describes a tendency in U.S. policy towards, let's say, excessive optimism, or maybe just a really persistent, almost innocent belief in certain diplomatic outcomes.
Even when the evidence points the other way.
Especially when the evidence points the other way. That's the key.
So when we talk about this kind of naivete, what's the big example that jumps out from the sources? Is it the whole two-state solution thing?
Absolutely. That's a prime example. Washington's unwavering commitment to the two-state solution as, like, the only viable path. Despite what scholars like Khalidi call its increasingly spectral nature. There's this widespread peace process fatigue. The main point here is that U.S. policy often seems to cling to these aspirational goals, even when the reality on the ground just doesn't line up. It creates this kind of persistent disconnect.
It sounds like insisting a boat with known leaks is still going to win the America's Cup. That's one analogy used, right?
Exactly. It captures that sense of, well, perceived futility, pushing this narrative despite things like the relentless expansion of Israeli settlements.
The numbers there are stark, aren't they?
They are. We're talking over 280 settlements since '67, housing around 700,000 settlers, plus the fragmentation of Palestinian territories, hardening political views.
Right.
It makes the two-state push feel, as Dr. Zephyr Gumption Riley put it, less like diplomacy and more like a collective act of wishful thinking.
And it's not just the two-state solution focus, is it?
Mm-hmm.
The sources also talk about the U.S. belief that just providing aid and diplomacy will somehow automatically lead to peace.
Yeah, and sort of ignoring the fact that a lot of that money funds military operations that critics often call disproportionate. And this naivete, it also shows up in how the U.S. handles criticism. Think about when Amnesty International back in 2022 or Human Rights Watch in 2021 described Israel's policies using the term apartheid.
How did the U.S. respond?
Typically, it was just, we disagree, or dismissing these really detailed reports as unhelpful, just kind of brushing them aside.
Some sources also float this idea of a Cold War hangover. Is that part of the naivete?
It could be. The idea is that Israel was seen as this crucial democratic ally against Soviet influence back then.
And old habits die hard.
Pretty much. Continuing to operate on that old script today in a totally different world looks to some critics like, well, diplomatic inertia, a failure to update the software, so to speak.
Okay, so if naivete is optimism despite the evidence, what's the next lens? Delusion.
Right, delusion. Think of it as optimism on steroids, as one source put it. This is where the gap between U.S. policy pronouncements and factual accountability seems to widen even further.
And a big part of this seems to be what Mearsheimer and Walt call the myth of the moral ally.
Exactly. The constant framing of Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East.
Even though millions of Palestinians under occupation don't have the same rights.
Precisely. Mearsheimer and Walt argue this narrative often overrides actual accountability based on, facts on the ground. It becomes this self-reinforcing belief.
And there's this other concept mentioned, delusional symmetry. What's that about?
It's this tendency for Washington to frame negotiations as if they're between two equal parties.
When they're clearly not.
Well, critics argue it ignores the huge disparities in military power, economic leverage, international clout. Edward Saida wrote about this years ago. It creates this fundamental disconnect in how policy is made and how it's seen.
How does that play out practically? Does it just stall things, or does it actually harm one side?
It can lead to actions that just look contradictory, like the U.S. pushing for ceasefires in Gaza.
While also supplying the very weapons being used.
Exactly. Simultaneously sending precision-guided munitions. Our sources say this kind of thing left allies, countries like Ireland, Canada, just scratching their heads wondering about the consistency.
And it's not just other countries. What about public opinion here in the U.S.?
That's another disconnect. A 2024 Pew Research poll showed, 53% of Americans viewing Israel unfavorably. That's up quite a bit from 2022.
Yet policy stays the course.
Largely, yes. Steadfastly pro-Israel, which really raises questions about, how responsive the policy is.
Okay, so we've covered naivete and delusion, sort of states of mind. The next lens, enablement, sounds more active.
It is. This is maybe the most potent accusation, focusing more on actions or sins of action, as the outline puts it, rather than just perception.
And this brings us straight to military aid, right? The big numbers.
Huge numbers. The U.S. provides billions every year. The Congressional Research Service pegs it around $3.8 billion annually in recent years.
And historically.
Well over $260 billion since 1948, according to one source, Sharp. Another mentions over $150 billion. It's consistently massive support.
And the key criticism here is that it's unconditional.
That's what critics like Mearheimer and Walt really focus on. They argue this unconditional nature gives Israel a lot of strategic freedom, minimizing consequences for actions that others, including sometimes the U.S. itself, find problematic.
There's that quote from Professor I. M. Critical.
Yeah, the one about giving your friend a limitless credit card and then just sort of tut-tutting when they buy a small island.
It paints a picture.
It does. The argument boils down to this. Is it just support, or is it effectively sponsorship? Enabling Israel to use U.S. weapons to enforce policies like the occupation.
So if the aid is unconditional, what about checks and balances? How does the U.S. try to influence things? Or does it?
That's where the other side of enablement comes in, the diplomatic shield. Specifically, the UN veto.
Ah, right. Blocking resolutions critical of Israel in the Security Council.
Consistently. Just since October 2023, the U.S. vetoed multiple ceasefire resolutions. The justification was often that they were unbalanced for not condemning Hamas.
Even as the civilian death toll in Gaza was climbing dramatically, past 42,000 according to reports cited.
Exactly. And the effect, critics say, is to shield Israel from international pressure, creating the sense that it can operate outside normal international standards without, major repercussions.
A geopolitical get-out-of-jail-free card, as one source put it.
That's the phrase. And this enablement also seems to extend to ignoring potential violations of law.
How so?
Well, sources mention internal State Department reports documenting hundreds, maybe over 500 potential Israeli violations of international law.
But no arms sales were stopped.
Apparently not. And when groups like Human Rights Watch and Oxfam called for an arms embargo, the White House reportedly dismissed the idea as not credible. It really underscores that sins of action point.
Okay, that's enablement. So the final lens is denial. How does this differ from, say, naivete or delusion?
Denial is more about actively or maybe passively ignoring inconvenient truths. It's the art, as one source colorfully put it, of looking the other way.
So a reluctance to really grapple with the tough realities of the conflict, like the impact of the occupation.
Yes, downplaying the impact on Palestinian daily life, human rights, economic development. You hear statements of concern about settlement expansion, for example.
But they don't seem to have much teeth.
Critics say they're often pro forma, lacking real bite. Dr. Pollyanna observed that the U.S. tends to see the conflict mainly through the lens of Israeli security needs.
To the point where Palestinian grievances become, what? Background noise.
That's the quote, background noise. The core idea is that this isn't just accidental ignorance. It's a kind of strategic, selective attention that shapes the whole policy approach.
And that selective hearing really comes through with the apartheid label rejection we mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Despite Amnesty's detailed 2022 report talking about a cruel system of domination, the official U.S. line remains that Israel is a model democracy.
How does that square with America's image as a global defender of human rights? Does it create credibility issues?
It definitely creates challenges on the world stage. And it extends to other things, too, like when Gaza hospitals were bombed or when so many journalists were killed. The figure cited is over 180 media workers since October 2023.
What was the U.S. response then?
Often it involved questioning the casualty numbers or placing blame on Hamas, even when UN bodies or medical studies in journals like The Lancet were validating the high death tolls.
Wow. And there was something about aid obstruction findings being rejected.
Yeah, reports suggest White House lawyers pushed back against findings that Israel was deliberately blocking humanitarian aid, despite evidence presented by groups like Oxfam showing severe restrictions.
So it's not just turning a blind eye, but maybe actively constructing a counter-narrative to maintain that moral high ground.
That's certainly how critics interpret it, maintaining the narrative by strategically denying inconvenient facts about an ally's actions.
Which really brings us to the core question underlying all these lenses. Why? Why does this peculiar situation seem to persist?
Right. It's definitely not simple, not just one thing. It seems to be a complex mix of powerful, interconnected forces. Not necessarily malicious intent, but a confluence.
Okay, what's factor number one? History.
History looms large. Deep-rooted historical and, frankly, emotional ties, forged after the Holocaust, cemented during the Cold War. That sentiment is powerful and can definitely overshadow current realities.
Then there's domestic politics, right? The lobbying aspect.
Undeniably. The influence of what Mearsheimer and Walt called a highly effective pro-Israel lobbying apparatus in Washington is significant.
Making it politically risky to criticize.
Very risky. They're strong bipartisan sport, generally speaking. Senator Bernie Sanders has talked openly about how groups like AIPAC can go after critics. That phrase, Israel has a right to defend itself, becomes almost a required statement for political survival in some contexts.
Okay, so history, domestic politics.
Yeah.
What else? Strategic interests.
Perceived strategic interests, yes. The belief that Israel is still a vital strategic partner in a very unstable Middle East.
A bulwark against threats like Iran.
Primarily Iran, yes. That perception often seems to trump other considerations, as the saying goes, when policies are decided.
And then there's this idea of diplomatic inertia, the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The U.S. has invested decades of diplomatic effort, political capital into certain frameworks, like the two-state solution narrative.
So it's hard to just walk away, even if it's not working.
Exactly. There's a natural reluctance to abandon something you've poured so much into, even if the returns are diminishing. Professor Sinek had that quip about polishing a very expensive, slightly wonky antique.
That makes sense. And we also can't ignore ideology, can we? Particularly the role of evangelical Christians.
No, that's a significant factor, especially within the Republican base. For many evangelicals, supporting Israel is tied to interpretations of biblical prophecy. It gives the issue a dimension beyond just geopolitics.
And more cynically, perhaps, economic convenience.
Yeah.
The arms deals.
Well, the military-industrial complex certainly doesn't mind those large, regular arms sales. That $13.5 billion package mentioned in sources is just one example. It's a factor.
Another point raised is the weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations.
Right. The argument is that legitimate criticism of Israeli government policies is sometimes quickly, maybe too quickly, labeled as anti-Semitism.
Which shuts down debate.
It can certainly have a chilling effect, yeah, silencing potentially legitimate discussion.
Trita Parsi brings up cognitive dissonance. What's the idea there?
Parsi suggests that U.S. policy might be driven more by inertia than clear intent, trying to hold two contradictory ideas at once. Championing human rights in general, while enabling actions seen as oppressive in this specific case.
Which leads to that really provocative idea.
Yeah.
Maybe the U.S. isn't actually naive or delusional at all.
But maybe a calculated enabler.
Exactly. Strategic hypocrisy, perhaps.
The argument goes something like this. By shielding Israel from full accountability, the U.S. maintains a reliable outpost in the Middle East, projects power, keeps certain regional actors in check.
So the naivete could be a performance, a strategic facade.
It's a possibility raised in the sources, a way to mask underlying real politic calculations. It's a pretty cynical view, but it's out there.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the perception of the U.S. government acting in these ways, naive, delusional, and enabling, in denial regarding Israel, it really reflects this deep ingrained pattern.
A pattern of immense financial and diplomatic support, often seeming, at least to critics, decoupled from consistent accountability for actions on the ground.
And while the U.S. champions human rights and international law elsewhere,
Its application of those principles seems, well, less consistent when it comes to this particular ally.
And that has consequences, right, for America's credibility.
Absolutely. We're seeing reports like those mentioning 2025 polling showing growing unfavorable views of Israel, even among close allies like Australia and Japan. If allies see inconsistency, it can erode trust.
Plus, there are those shifting tides within the U.S. you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, especially among younger Americans, and notably within the Democratic Party. One source cited 69% of Dems viewing Israel unfavorably in 2025 polling. Public opinion isn't monolithic, and it seems to be evolving.
So it's a complex picture constantly shifting.
It really is. As observers, all we can do is keep highlighting these apparent inconsistencies, these paradoxes, maybe with a bit of analysis, a bit of wit, hoping eventually.
The rose-tinted glasses come off.
Or at least get updated with a clearer prescription.
Because the alternative raises a tough question for you to think about. Does the U.S. risk becoming, as one source wondered, a pariah's plus one, if it doesn't find a way to better align its immense support with demands for accountability? Something to mull over.